quickly through that. First, you've got to realise where it's all coming from. It comes from many places, and what we've got here is power sector, industry, transport, land use, which is, think mostly of deforestation. So deforestation at the moment is causing bigger emissions than transport. So if you're going to be successful in cutting emissions, you're not just thinking about electricity, you're not just thinking about transport, you've got to think right across the board. Also, you've got to think about countries, and the countries which are the major emitters are essentially the biggest countries. If you look back in the past, or the biggest economies, if you look back in the past, it's the rich countries that are responsible for 75 or 80% of the greenhouse gas concentrations that are up there now. But of course, as China and India grow, and we hope they continue to grow, if they were to follow business as usual, then China would become probably the biggest emitter, perhaps 10, 15, 20 years from now. So there's a difference, as it were, looking back and the historical responsibility, and looking forward as to where the big growth in emissions would come. But what this tells us is you've got to look across sectors and you've got to look across countries if you're going to get real traction on policy which is going to bring down the emissions. The UK is just 2% of the emissions at the moment. India is just 4% of emissions at the moment. China much more. United States much more. 20-some percent. Europe as a whole about 15% of emissions. You've got to bring all those people in some way. And what we argue is that this is giving you the amount of emissions that would be captured by different combinations of countries, moving up here to the top 20 on the right-hand side, starting down at the bottom left with the European Union. So the vertical distance in these columns here is the emissions of those countries, and then the green things here are the fraction of those that could be covered under emissions trading of the kind that we currently have in the EU. So the bottom left, right at the bottom left corner, the slightly different coloured green there, is the stuff that's covered under emissions trading now in Europe. And the point we're making here is first that the stuff that's covered under emissions trading in Europe is quite a lot, but very far from all, a little bit under half of the emissions. And if you look at bringing in the top 20 emitters, you could multiply that by about 5 times. So an expansion of trade could give you a very big coverage of emissions in terms of the possibility of controlling them through carbon trading. So that's the story of the expansion of something like the EU trading scheme, which would allow a big expansion in the amount of carbon that is actually controlled under emissions trading. Policy then, and I've spoke about trading first, but policy then has to be around the price for carbon. You can do that through tax, you can do that through trading, you can do that through standards. We argue that that won't be enough, although it's essential to have an incentive to cut back on carbon. You have to have a price of carbon, and some kind of incentive can be implicit through regulation and standards, but some incentive has to be there. Second, we argue for a big expansion of R&D. Energy R&D has fallen in the last 20 years. It's cut back to about half the level it was in the 80s. So we argue it should at least be put back fairly quickly to that level. So there's an R&D story, but there's a deployment story as well, and we argue strongly for expanded deployment incentives to bring to market some of those technologies which have opportunities but seem to be quite distant in the future. So that's the kind of thing for energy transport sectors looking forward, some combination of these policies of tax, trade, regulation for the price, and R&D and deployment in terms of pushing technologies forward. Trees, of course, very important. The previous slide showed that they were 18% of total emissions, and what we argue for is some strong and early action on pilot schemes and get strong schemes on deforestation going. We do talk a little bit in the report about persuasion and understanding. Economists talk mostly about price incentives, sticks and carrots. But what we argue